This is a real treat. You've got a very lovely bio, very comprehensive in your package, and I'd encourage you to read it because this is a partial representation of a long and distinguished career. So I'm not going to repeat the bio. I'm just going to say a few things from a personal level. Anne's got a ton of accomplishments. One of the most important, I think, is that a few years ago she was made an officer in the Order of Canada. So congratulations again for that, Anne. That's a terrific accomplishment. I met Anne in 2004-05 when I started on the Institute of Aging Board at CIHR. I remember a lot of discussions about aging rat brains. Anne assures me that that was a minor part of what we talked about. But two things did happen during the time I was there, and I want to speak to them because they go to the kind of individual Anne is. We launched a Mobility and Aging initiative, which was very important and I hope made a lot of difference in this country, and I would like us to relaunch it or do a new, better version 2.1. And we launched the Canadian Longitudinal Studying in Aging, which is a very important study for Canada. It's kind of on the order of the Framingham, if you are familiar with that study on nurses and heart disease years ago. What I learned from that was that Anne, she's a Newfoundlander, and she's lovely, and she's generous, and she's kind. She's also really strategic, and you don't even know you've been strategized sometimes. She's so nice about it. So she's very skillful as a strategist, very skillful at gathering people. And I'm sure that part of that comes from the Newfoundland origins. One of the best Institute of Aging meetings I ever was at was in Newfoundland. I'd never been to Mile Zero. I'd never seen Newfoundland in the sunshine, so we had a good day in October. And we had a wonderful lobster church supper, which some of the folks from regions of Canada I shall not mention did not appreciate nearly as much as others of us. And we also had a terrific meeting in Charlottetown. I had some very fond memories of meeting with Anne and watching her strategize, watching her mentor, watching her gathering people together. Everywhere I go, I run into somebody in the aging field who's been taught by, mentored, or supervised by Anne. So she's a bit of a national treasure. She's a good friend, and she's going to talk to us, I think, about a look back at this very long and distinguished career. So I want to thank Anne for coming. I want to thank her for all the mentoring and other good work she's done in Canada. She's made a real difference, and welcome you to the stage.
I'm here because back in January, I was beginning to teach my last ever course in Aging and Society at the University of British Columbia. And I got in touch with Carol because while I had the Restoring Trust, the Royal Society of Canada document on the reading list for my graduate class, I wanted the students to be exposed to what I think is just one of the finest examples of research and knowledge translation underway in the country at this time. So I fired an email off to Carol just to see if she had, I was hoping she'd suggest one article which exemplified the work that you're doing. She sent me 2.5 pages of references. But in the course of that back and forth, at one point, and I brought a note here so I could remember it, Carol writes, "Here's a good idea." Now, when Carol says, "Here's a good idea," you take notice, right? "Here's a good idea. Interested in being a guest speaker at our conference. You do a lot of work that we don't do," because I work in home and community care, "but that's okay. Just wanted someone who cares about older folks and their families." Yeah, I think I qualify. "And is interesting and enthusiastic. Think it over." So that's my remit, folks, for the next 40 minutes. So you can tell me if it's interesting, and even though it's only barely 8 a.m. in British Columbia, and I'm not a morning person, I will try to be enthusiastic. Over the time that we'll be meeting today, and some of these topics have actually already been alluded to, which is really, really helpful. I want to talk a little bit about positionality, where we're coming from, living our subject matter as those of us who work in aging. Going to spend the bulk of our time together really just talking about some of the changes in the aging and older population, a little bit on families and societies, and then end with some reflections on what I think are opportunities and challenges, some of the binary thinking that we're doing, the nature of data, and then some wake-up calls. Carol alluded to that actually in her remarks, but wake-up calls that I think we who work in aging have to be aware of. We've seen a lot of Venn diagrams already this morning, but this, I just wanted to show that for you, this is how I think. I was trained as a sociologist. I always think in terms of how these three areas in the Venn diagram come together. Are the issues that we're addressing, they're at the level of the individual, the aging older person, but also how the roles of the social group, family, friends, and society, bureaucracy, intersect in that particular space. A colleague in Oregon, Joe Hendricks, his name is John, but we call him Joe Hendricks, wrote a very interesting paper several years ago in the Journal of Aging Studies called Coming of Age. And he has a wonderful line in there, several lines. Those of us who study aging have the unique opportunity to live their subject matter. Personal experience can make us far better scholars than scholarship alone. Do our scholarly efforts and our experience come together in ways that enrich one another? How do we integrate what we know with how we live? As someone myself who's now become what I have been teaching my whole career and talking about, I'm really aware of the opportunity to reflect back over a career, to think about how what we're living intersects with what we're doing research on. So much of my career has involved, particularly for the last 25, 30 years, research on home and community care, largely informed by my mother having a stroke and living for 14 years at home with the support of family before her death. Paralyzed on one side, all those years, how did systems come together and support her? So a nice example, I think, of standing back and thinking, my study families, what's the dynamic, what's going on here? But I've also become aware as I've gotten older of the issues of aging as a process, a phase, stage. Janice Keefe, I've applauded her use of the word pathways. I think that's how increasingly we have to think about later life. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Pathways, the processes, the phases parts. I was raised Irish Catholic in Newfoundland, and if you know anything about being Irish Catholic in Newfoundland, you know we focus a lot on issues of sins of omission as well as commission. What we have done and what we have failed to do. And I was realizing recently how much that has framed the way I think about things. I'm always looking at what are we not seeing here? What have we not done? And you alluded to that, some of you, in your remarks earlier this morning, because we think we have to stand back often and think about those issues. I, through my career, have done what someone described to me, it came as a surprise when they said it. I tend to look prospectively and retrospectively. I have gone back and analyzed data from previously. Carol's point was really important on that. We need to constantly reflect back and think, what didn't we see then because we didn't know what we were looking for or we didn't have the tools? So these are really important aspects of that positionality for me. But before we go any further, I do want to remind us, this to me is a really important slide, because we can forget how unprecedented the issues that we are addressing, how pervasive issues of population aging, enduring the phenomenon that we're dealing with and the issues. We're not returning to the younger populations our ancestors knew, even when we get through the wave of baby boomers, and the profound implications for many facets of life. So I just want to remind us of this constantly. And I will just say in passing, I've embedded links, hot links in some of my slides, so I don't know if they'll be made available to you later, but if they are, then you'll have the opportunity to dig deeper. This is an image, this is a statistic, we're all very much aware of that. By 2020 and worldwide, the data tend to focus on 60 and over, not 65, that people over the age of 60 will comprise 22% of the population, and the proportions of people in those age groups will double in Canada. And there have been, in the recent decade, a plethora of reports from all over the world, particularly the United Nations, which really focus on this 22% of the world's population over the age of 60. But I think that those reports and that focus that we constantly have on the proportions over 65 miss some really important issues. We know that many people are living to old age. What we less frequently recognize is that more people are living longer in old age, that we have a co-longevity of generations that is historically unprecedented. and how that is going to shape the future that we're talking about. So there are implications, and I can't get into all of them today, but for society, care, housing, economics, financial security, and that recognition of that process, the length of time we're living in old age, and what happens over the course of those years, that requires a different research focus than we often actually apply. So I'll keep coming back to the language of transitions, trajectories, processes, and pathways, because they are important. I quite like this recent report from the United Nations on the Decade of Healthy Aging. And one reason I like it more than many is that, yes, it cites that old familiar statistic on people age 60 and over, but it's one of the few to recognize the additional years of life that we have when we reach that point. So 22 years for those 62, for reaching age 60. That's on average. There's a lot of years of life that people have. I also just want to recognize here inequities and inequalities. I'm not talking about those today. I'm talking about more in generalities, but there's so much variability by gender, by race, culture, indigeneity. There's a lot that we don't know and need to know here, and I'm not going to be diving into that as I would otherwise like. I'm very struck by what I think is the problematic notion of 65 and over. And actually, even recently at a gerontology conference in Vancouver, I was really surprised to hear people constantly talk about 65 and over. It's a very homogenizing way of thinking. It's not recognizing the heterogeneity that we have 2, if not 3 generations over the age of 65. Statistics Canada has a data point that indicates that 10% of those over 65 have a child over age 65. That statistic is a bit old. I can find a more current one. If anyone has access, I'd love to see it. I think it's higher than that, but at least 10% have a child over 65. These next couple of bullets describe friends of mine. And I'm sure every one of you in this room knows someone who's over that magical 60 or 65 who has a parent or parents older than that. And of course, some of the interesting work near Barzilai and in New York, looking at supercentenarians, some wonderful videos depicting a young man age 60 with his father 82 and his grandfather 104. 3 generations over the age of 65. So I'm trying increasingly in my own work, and as I go back and look at what I've done and written, is to actually recognize that we've got these at least 2 generations over 65. They are distinct one from the other. We can talk about comparisons and contrasts, but they're also us, because we're going to happily, hopefully, process into becoming that older generation. So this is where the process phases, stages language comes into play, but they may also be coincident. And they're increasingly, we're acknowledging this aging together, where you've got these multiple generations, often in the same family, who are aging together and what the implications of that are. When I taught my graduate class, I actually included 2 books for the students to read. One is Gillian Ranson's Front Wave Boomers, and that is, as you might expect, focused on the younger age group, those who've just entered later life. And a marvelous book by Mika Lowe, an American based on data from an ethnographic study in New England, focused on people 85 to 102. Very rare to actually find something really focused on that older age group. And there's wonderful recognition in there of terms like stubborn resilience and what it takes to get by when you're living from 85 to 102. It's just a different language than we typically see. But this is getting at the distinction when you look at the groups over 65. But if you start to think about process, that I'm going to be 72 on my next birthday. I hope to reach that 80, 85 age group. As we move through life, there will be stages and trajectories. So I cite here a colleague formerly from Alberta, Ross Heppel, gave me this several years ago. So I think this is a pretty buff figure at the age of 67. This is as good as you're going to look, wouldn't you say, folks? Allowing for some differences in camera angle, unfortunately, you can see that by age 79, he's changed. And we might argue this is as good as you're going to look at that stage. Russ and I discussed this because it's showing that, at least in biological terms, there are changes. You have to recognize that there are differences as we do get older. What this slide is showing you that, yeah, we've got these different age groups. The numbers are getting smaller as we get into the older age groups, 100 and above here, 90 to 100. So there are real issues. Victor Marshall talks about awareness of finitude. There's often a real concern for people. And my husband's going to be 80 on his next birthday. And we talk about things like, gee, you just don't know. Have you got 20 weeks, 20 months, or 20 years? What have you got? And how that shapes your understanding of the next phase of your life. And he and I have talked about how you start to think that way when you get into your mid-70s and into your 80s. You don't talk about that in the early stages of later life in the same way. So just recognizing that we do lose people, we lose friends, we lose connections. So the populations are different one from the other. I squeezed this slide in here just to show you the percentage changes in the world's population. This 80 and above group, or this, it says 85 here, it's growing, it's expanding, and of course, this is the population of people who are going to feed into the environments that TREC has focused on. Really, really important to recognize the differences here. In terms of focus on numbers, I don't want to give a class in demography, but I think we do have to anchor here in terms of the reality of the situation. I was born in 1951. This is the number of people over the age of 80 in the world at that time. Look where it's projected by 2050. Even look at where we are in 2025. 394 million people, the estimates are, over the age of 80 at that point in time. Huge growth. I do not think we're talking about this as much as we need to in the language of age 65 and over. So we've got a global population of the oldest old. The estimates are, or I say oldest old, I shouldn't. Janice Keefe reminded me of the reason, and I do have it in here in various places, longer lived older people. But that population, let's say 80 or 85 and older, is tripling. Some of the estimates coming out of other organizations like this Aging World Report suggests actually 446 million, not 397. And I'll just note here that Jay Olshansky and some colleagues at the MacArthur Institute, MacArthur Foundation in the US have actually said there's an underestimation, not of many estimates, but of many projections. And some wonderful graphs showing, even on basics of census, we still haven't got it right in terms of nailing the projections. This translates into a lot of people, and you alluded to this, Carol. This population is growing. Why does this matter, particularly for those of you who focus especially on long-term care? So let me go back to when I started teaching in 1978 at the University of Guelph. There was something that we would talk about then, and the language we used was the 4% fallacy. That's what it was called back in those days. And that was because at that time, we were estimating that about 4% of the population was residing in long-term care. So if we say today, approximately it's 8.5% to 9% cross-sectional data, we'd probably call it the 8% fallacy today. But whatever the number is in terms of this fallacy, the reality is, and you'll see this on the slide, some of the measures here, is that when we continually talk that way, and I've fallen into that trap, actually, to say, oh, it's a small proportion of the population. Yes, that's on any given day. But what we see when we start to dig deeper is how biased that measure is against people whose period of time in an institutional setting may in fact have been quite short. So some of the data coming out of the US and some of the commentaries are emphasizing, and you know this, the misconception that very few people end up using long-term care. The bottom line and the reality is that most people will need some form of long-term care support. It may not always be in institutional settings. It might be home-based, and that's the idea, isn't it, that we'll be able to age in place more and stay there. These kinds of data represent wake-up calls for us in terms of the high proportions of the population who will require, in some context, long-term care in the future. This speaks to the importance of the work that you're doing and the ongoing need for it. Remember that TV commercial which says, but wait, there's more. because there is more. We're getting even older and older, and we're seeing increasing references to the 100-year life. And look what our colleagues are telling us, that as we move into the future, the children born in 2011, 1 in 3 females and 1 in 4 males could reach age 100. So this phenomenon is not going away anytime soon. I put in the last column just as a little reality check, though, because with all of the focus on expanding the lifespan, the Methuselah Foundation's promotion of an ageless society, whatever, it's interesting to think that while I was teaching my class this year, we talked about the fact that the oldest living person had died at age 118 and has now been replaced by the oldest living person is 115. But it's important to remember that Jean Calment, the longest person who ever lived, over age 122, died nearly 26 years ago. We have not expanded the lifespan. We haven't extended the lifespan in that period of time, despite quite significant work by quite a number of biologists of aging. It's just interesting to think that there obviously is a natural end, but that's less the focus than it was even earlier in my career. I think that's important to recognize. But we are increasingly growing older, with implications that Carol alluded to. So to end this section, I think it is important to think about deep old age, old age, long-lived older people, which I would argue many of us in social gerontology do not do enough thinking about. It is surprising, in fact, how relatively few studies worldwide actually focus on aged 80 and over. The Newcastle 85+ study, the Finnish Vitality 90+ study are among the few. Obviously, a number of longitudinal studies are useful here as well. But what Newcastle's research shows us is the diversity of capability at age 85. And that is strongly emphasized, that increasing longevity is not necessarily associated with very high disability or dependency. Some could argue these people are survivors. They've lived that long. And I've noted here the work of Nir Barzilai, because I think some of his work on centenarians is really interesting. And I'll just say in passing, 2 of the things that they've identified is that superagers, compared to most of us mere mortals, have very high levels of HDL, good cholesterol, and very short telomeres. So you can bet that the pharmaceutical industry is trying to find a way to synthetically reproduce what would enhance very high levels of good cholesterol. If there was a breakthrough there, even more of us may be living longer. Just to finish the reflections in this part of my presentation, I recently did and I won't say it was a systematic review, it was just a overview, a quick skim of a number of journals where I looked at the first few articles or the most cited articles. And I obviously didn't include ones that were looking at retirement planning, et cetera, where you might have a younger population. But where the study implied it was a survey of older people themselves, a study of older people. And I was struck repeatedly by how many of those studies, the subjects, the participants in the studies were between the ages of 72 and 74. That was the average age. They weren't in the older age groups that I'm talking about. The studies were obviously primarily cross-sectional. Rarely was there a focus on transitions and trajectories. So the kind of work that you're doing is rare and it's important, and there's not that much of it, at least in the journals that I am typically looking at. I didn't scan the biomedical journals, but this was certainly in the social gerontology area. So let's take a couple of minutes now and just think about family lives and structures. Some of the issues we need to be aware of there. And Carol, again, alluded to this in some of her notation of her experiences in Atlantic Canada. Families, they're smaller. They're longer, more generations. They're fluid. We now have issues of focusing on fictive kin, families of choice, family-like relationships. So we're certainly very much more flexible in terms of our understandings of family ties, and they are distant. I think COVID will help us in the long term understand, does that matter if we're geographically dispersed? But what does it actually do for understanding and knowledge and trust of the sort that Carol was describing in a family where they all were proximate. There are fewer births. There are fewer children. And recently, for example, Japan has recently declared it does not know how it will continue to function as a society if more children are not born. So the lack of children, the low birth weight, will have longer-term implications. Marriages are later, if happening at all. Later life divorce, it's not necessarily more prevalent, although many of us think that we see more examples of it, but it does exist. And I mentioned the geographical distance issue, the migration and mobility. Perhaps the trend that is quite intriguing when you're a social scientist looking at the future is what is deemed going solo. This is historically unprecedented. And some of the data out of the United States show, this is a book by Klein and Berg on going solo, the increased number and proportion of people who are single, that includes those three groups, the number of years adults are spending as single, and the estimates are that as many as a third the population of the United States, for example, is going solo, and just the increase in the numbers. We don't know yet what the implications of this are, but Gunhild Hagestad has studied this in Norway and has said, particularly when you look at young men, or men between the ages of 35 and 44, twice as many going solo, being single, in their age group than was the case 10 years ago. Indication of the issue of contract between the generations, not seeing that it's relevant to me to support a publicly funded school system. Why should I care? Is that relevant? Why should I fund a publicly funded system of care for people as they age? The epidemic of loneliness. We know we have a minister of loneliness in the UK now. Maybe our colleagues can talk with us about that. So I'm just noting this as an implication we need to be aware of. This is a slide I asked Janice Keefe if I could show you. There's a lot here to unpack, but right in the middle in that blue band is the bottom line. The proportion of 85 plus with no surviving children will steadily increase. That's what these are Canadian data that Janice and colleagues from Montreal worked on. So that means the potential of adult children as caregivers will decline. And this is important to note when we're talking about the future and what the future is going to look like. The bottom line of this slide is most people 65 plus do not need help, and that's what this is showing. So I think it'd be really interesting to look at what this would show if you looked at 80 or 85 and over. What portions of that age group does not need any help? So these are just sort of contextual factors, and as Carol said, context is everything, to understand that the system moving up, the availability of family ties to provide the kind of care that we know is so important in shoring up and supporting long-term care in later life is changing. Now, in my last couple of slides, I want to quickly go through a number of challenges and opportunities around life expectancy, our mindset on binaries, data. Colleen Flood is here. Data everywhere is a title of something I read of yours a long, long time ago, Colleen. And then some made in Canada reality checks, and end with a reflection on TREC. So there are some suggestions now of a possible decline in life expectancy in the United States moving forward. This was pre-pandemic, largely due to an epidemic of obesity, but just reading yesterday the data on diabetes, and the increase in diabetes, we do not know how that's going to impact life expectancy going forward. So we know COVID certainly reduced the life expectancy in the United States for the first time in recorded history. We're starting to see those trends. We don't hear as much about antimicrobial resistance as we used to a couple of years ago, but we know it's there, we know it's an issue. That too could have an impact on the populations we're talking about. Another challenge, primary care. Oh my goodness, if we don't get this right, we're going to have an issue, because there's people not seeing doctors, things are not getting treated, problems that will just become worse and will emerge later in the environments in which many of you work, will become issues if we can't do something about fixing primary care. On the other hand, I was reading the New York Times on Saturday, and it was actually talking about a golden age for medicine. All these discoveries, a lot of evidence of how the mRNA, the vaccine, what some of the lessons could be from that process, that too could have an impact on extending longevity in ways that we can't even imagine yet. So these are all issues for us to be aware of in terms of things that will complicate a future that I've tried to identify. One thing that has struck me often in looking at the gerontological literature is the seeing in binary. And I'm going to leave it to you whether you're seeing the goblet or the two men, or you're seeing the older woman or the younger woman, or maybe you're seeing both of them all at the same time. But in our language, we often, in aging, we often talk about this versus that. So let me give you a couple of examples of that thinking and how often the reality is somewhere in the middle. There's a continuum between these things, and that's what we need to be focusing on. Looking at aging and old age and binary opposition, I've already alluded to this notion of homogeneity of a population versus the multiple generations, the heterogeneity. We're seeing increasingly, whereas we used to focus a lot on the process of this disease and that disease and what we could learn from diabetes and cancer and cardiovascular, much more in recent years, a focus on the processes of aging. What do all these diseases have in common? They all increase in frequency as we get older. Is it a better approach to actually start looking at what aging is telling us here? So we see the emergence of gerosciences as a way of thinking about understanding aging. And I did note actually that the Canadian Association on Gerontology and the Canadian Frailty Network are actually going to have a conference on geroscience in October. This has really come a long way, this integrative way of thinking about, particularly around biological aspects of aging. The high-tech equipment driving many of the costs that often get attributed to aging, and some interesting work Alan Cassels has done even here in Alberta, looking at the rise of just the proliferation of very expensive diagnostic equipment versus low-tech. And geriatricians will talk about, for many older people, the thing that's needed most is time in the encounter with the healthcare professional. Time, the low-tech of time. Life expectancy versus healthy life expectancy, been a real tension around those issues in the field. We know that the extra years of life expectancy that most women have are not healthy years. For the most part, they are not healthy years. That's what we need to be focusing on rather than the relentless pursuit of expanding life expectancy, is the quality of life in those years and what we can do. I won't go through each and every one of these, but one acute problem versus many chronic conditions. As we get older, we've got many chronic conditions. But we go to physicians' offices where, in the one that I go to, there's a sign, one problem at a time. That's what the physician has time to discuss. And literally, I've been cut off. That's two, that's number two. We can't get into that one. The fantasy of an ageless society, I've alluded to this, versus much better placed preparation for longer lives. That's where we do need to have our emphasis. This one's always an interesting one to me. This notion of the sky is falling, aging as apocalyptic, one of the worst things that could have ever have happened to society, when in fact this is an extraordinary societal achievement. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And then the epidemic of dementia, on the one hand, versus we're healthier than ever. 70 is the new 60 or 70 is the new 50. So we've got these kinds of competing notions. They're all true. It's just understanding that it's not one versus the other, that many of these things are part of a continuum, as I said. I think one of the real opportunities moving forward, and you certainly exemplify that with TREC, from advocacy to to partnership. Norma Drozdowicz, Carol, I think you worked on our IAB with Norma, was the first person I ever heard talk about this. We have to move from advocacy to partnership, from thinking in gerontology that we advocate for older people to partnerships with older people. And she really influenced us. The Institute of Aging actually helped fund this University of Calgary document called Grey Matters. It's free, it's available online, open access, on conducting research with older people, a very useful resource. So the data everywhere, that I think is the wonderful opportunity. of the time that we're in, that we have access to data. And I won't go through each of these. I'm on the board of the Health Data Research Network Canada, a CIHR-funded initiative relating to the strategy for patient-oriented research, really looking to see how can we better integrate and use the data from across the country, and all the way we collect data through separate health jurisdictions across Canada. Of course, we've got the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, and you've got TREC, and all those years of data that Carol has talked about on organizational context. Trainees, you've got a gold mine there to go through in a way that was just simply not available in the past. CLSA is just, I think, in many ways, just coming into its own now. Recruited 50,000 Canadians between the ages of 45 and 80. 80 was the upper age at intake. So those 80-year-olds, they've now been part of the study for 10 years, those who are still living. So that's going to start to yield, I think, more information of the sort that I've been alluding during this presentation. So research priorities and focus. I just want to notice, when I became scientific director of the Institute of Aging, a third of the budget went to dementia. I'm not saying that that's a problem, but there are things that we're not necessarily funding and supporting that we need to do. We know that worldwide, happily, there is a decline in the prevalence of dementia, but the number of cases, of course, are up, and they will continue to rise because there are, as Carol said, more of us. The focus of research more and more these days is on prevention and innovative treatment, such as in this Alive Inside, a wonderful video about the role of iPods and access to music that's been meaningful during one's life in terms of reaching the person inside the body of the human being with dementia. But it is interesting how we really have not had biomedical breakthroughs in the nearly 40 years of my career. We're not a lot further. Some say we're on the cusp. Carol stole my thunder because I think she gave you the answer here, because the WHO talks about what's the best guarantee of retaining independence and being able to cope in old age? Mobility. She talked about the Mobility and Aging Strategic Initiative. I firmly believe that this is an area we have got to be putting more resources into. This is a factor for so many people as they get older. So I'll just leave it there. I think you'll be aware of the importance. A life course perspective. I don't know if you'll be hearing much about that today. These are sort of the four basic tenets of a life course perspective. The historical, geographical context, how choices and actions are contingent upon constraints and opportunities. A recognition of a life course perspective, how people end up where they do, is fundamental to understanding longer-lived, older lives. And I've embedded here my little Venn diagram from the beginning, where I talk about the aging individual, society and bureaucracy, and social supports, and all of these together in relation to a life course perspective, vital to understanding how we move forward. I'm at my words of caution, wake-up call. So this is one of the people in Aging Worldwide, Tom Kirkwood, whom I supremely respect. He's a biologist of aging, but I think a real Renaissance man in some of the work that he's done. Tom has really issued us a wake-up call here. Aging is the biggest challenge as we progress further into the 21st century. It's a challenge that contains within it a threat. If we don't take action quickly enough, and I think we'd say we haven't, in the right kind of way, then what is unquestionably humanity's greatest success could become a real problem. And we have to be aware of that as we're moving forward. It is an opportunity, but there is a threat. From Canada, very recent, if many of you read the Globe and Mail, if you saw this op-ed by André Picard, he wrote it. It was in an article talking about BC sending cancer patients into the United States for treatment. And he was talking about how this is a disturbing sign of a collapsing system. Well, I've bolded in green what I think is the real wake-up call in André Picard's message. He is, as you may know, the health reporter for the Globe and Mail. At some point, we have to stop pretending that the aging of the population and the shift in care that needs to accompany it are a surprise. We have to be aggressively proactive, not pitifully reactive. And some of us have been around for 45 years. It amazes me, this element of surprise that does still overtake the system. You alluded to this briefly, Carol, as well. How do we move to the practices and policies that indicate a response and awareness of these issues? I think this is the wake-up call for those of us who maybe we've been talking to ourselves a lot, those of us who actually work as researchers. So the reaching out with you, stakeholders, is really where we have to go as we move forward. But we're still seeing this, and we have to bear in mind the real reality of what Picard is saying. Now, I've tried to suggest a number of issues that I think are going to be relevant as we move into the future. Some of the things we need to be aware of, doing a little bit of crystal ball gazing at some level. Am I any good at that? Am I prescient at all in my thinking? I was cleaning out my office recently, and look what I found. When I was scientific director of the Institute of Aging, at that point, in the middle of my term, CIHR turned 10 years old because it was created in 2000 from the Medical Research Council. So we were all asked, each scientific director of each institute was asked to think ahead 10 years to where we thought we would be 10 years hence. So this is actually a pretty tangible evidence of how I thought the future would look. It's win some, lose some, I would say. I've said in Canada and worldwide, the future's aging. The integrated focus of geroscience, yay, got that one right, geroscience, because it certainly is more prevalent in the literature, will advance our understanding of the processes of aging. The Canadian longitudinal study on aging, which was then just beginning, will enhance knowledge of how biomedical factors, et cetera, intersect with social, cultural, and economic context to impact aging and advanced age. 2 for 2, gerosciences, CLSA. Then I say, optimizing health and health services for very elderly people will become national priorities. Well, they're not, right? I wasn't right about that. 2020, these were not national priorities. But this is the work that you're doing. They're a priority for you, and that's really important. So 2 out of 3 in terms of what I've said today about thinking of the future. So a couple of final comments on TREC. We know it's so complex to talk about aging because issues of aging are at the intersection of so many policies and practices, and you know this, health and social services, labor, housing, immigration, transportation, etc. And I applaud TREC for the complexity of what you're trying to do in working at the heart of that system. TREC focuses on the long-term care system, which I, in my naivety, always thought, well, that's out there. That's separate from the work that I'm doing on home and community care. Well, I learned in my work with home support workers, people work all across systems. Some of the home support workers I interviewed were working for a private agency in the morning, and they were working for a public agency in the afternoon, and they were going and working in a long-term care facility on the weekend because they could make $2 an hour more in that context, trying to cobble together a working wage. So that was my wake-up call. These are not necessarily totally separate systems. They work together. And of course, families move in back and forth and across these systems as well. What I think is so wonderful about what TREC is doing, and it was first stated by Pat Armstrong, who was part of your Royal Society report, the conditions of work are the conditions of care. That is very much at the heart. You don't identify it as an assumption, but you're looking at the working conditions in long-term care, the communications between people who work in those environments, how that matters, how that flows. So I really want to applaud that. I'm also aware that many of us thought at the time that there was a window of opportunity with what COVID-19 revealed about long-term care. We thought surely when the Army was called in and reports were generated that things were going to change. And I remember a conversation with Dot Pringle crossing a street in Toronto. Dot, I remember the place and the moment, where Dot turned to me and she said, Anne, the window has already closed. It's not happening. But I have that card in my office because I am an eternal optimist. When a window closes, a door opens, or when a door closes, a window opens, whatever. TREC has a role here in keeping that crack in the door open. The relentless, and I would say tenacious, the building of long evidence-based into an implementation, a KT process, You're doing it, and I encourage you to keep doing that as you look to the future. A wonderful example that I like to cite, some of you may know Jeff Fernie, a now retired colleague at the University of Health Network in Toronto Rehab. Jeff, an engineer, was working for years on the issue of the rise and the run of stairs. And the rise is the height of a step, and the run is how deep, how long the step is. And if you go into some lovely old buildings, built 150 years ago, they've got really low rises and really long runs in many cases. But as the building industry, houses got smaller, just trying to compress the stairs got higher, the rise got higher, and the run got shorter. That's where most falls happen for people. It's a very dangerous environment. And Jeff was relentless, and he had all kinds of data in his belief that if we could lower the rise and increase the run, we would reduce the likelihood of falls on stairs. And he was telling me that it took him over 11 years of being on boards of like the Canadian Safety Standards Association, national building codes. He didn't get the 11 inches in the run that he wanted, but I think he got 9 inches from the 7, which is the current building standard. Huge implications for people as they get older. That's the example of just the tenacity, and I think you've demonstrated it, and I really want to applaud you in that. Final reflections as I look back over a 45-year career. When I started at the University of Guelph, my department head said to me, "Is this gerontology thing a flash in the pan or what?" Like he was really worried. He was hiring a couple of people in aging, and he kind of worried about that. And I assured him that it was not. As I look back over 45 years, because I will retire at the end of this year, so much has been done. The research that we've amassed, the evidence. Carol talked about scaling up, and I think we do have some good examples of having scaled up in Canada. We have a kind of data we could have only have dreamed about back then. We've got trainees, and I applaud you because you are the future with careers and you're making contributions. But if you'd asked me 45 years ago where I thought we'd be, like the 6-year-old in the back seat, are we there yet? I would have thought we would be a lot further along in terms of integrated care services for older people, of whom I am now happy to say I am one. So we are not there yet. We have a lot to do, and I look forward over the next day and a half to spending time with you as you discuss what you're going to do for the remaining time of TREC. So thank you very much.